The principal stared in shock at the contents of the drawer he had just opened, his mouth agape. Timmy felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, worried that he had caused trouble for his teacher. With a furious expression, the principal slammed the drawer shut, causing more liquid to spill onto the floor covered in paper towels. The children, startled by the sudden noise, turned to look at the principal. He shook his head in frustration and told them to wait while he arranged for a substitute teacher. Meet Timmy Kirkley, a model of consistency in a rapidly changing world. As a straight-A student devoted to routine and order, Timmy's life was defined by predictability. Every day he followed the same precise schedule, from waking up to bidding farewell to his classmates at school. Timmy's life was a well-oiled machine, smoothly running within the parameters of his meticulously crafted routine. From the way he packed his backpack to the exact route he took to school, his commitment to consistency was unwavering. Change was an unwelcome disruption to the harmony he worked so hard to maintain. Timmy stood out as the top student in his class, consistently excelling in every test and assignment. His straight-A grades were a clear reflection of his relentless commitment to his studies and his remarkable academic talent. However, what truly distinguished Timmy was his profound admiration for his teacher, Mrs. Thompson. She was more than just an educator to him. She was a beacon of guidance, illuminating his way through the complexities of school life. Mrs. Thompson's warm smile and encouraging words were the highlights of Timmy's day, the moments he treasured most. Her classroom felt like a sanctuary, where he was safe, valued, and surrounded by both knowledge and kindness. When Timmy returned to school one Monday to find Mrs. Thompson replaced by a substitute teacher, his world was turned upside down. Her absence due to maternity leave hit him hard, shattering the stability he had clung to. The familiar rhythms of his school day were disrupted, and Timmy struggled with the void left by his beloved teacher, longing for the comfort and guidance she provided. With a forced smile and a touch of nervousness, the temp introduced herself to the class, her voice slightly unsteady as she attempted to exude confidence. "Hi, kids. My name is Miss McMullen, and I'll be your substitute teacher for the next 3 months, until Mrs. Thompson returns from her maternity leave." Timmy, along with his classmates, greeted her politely, though the usual enthusiasm was noticeably missing. A sense of apprehension hung in the air, as if everyone felt that things were not quite right. Despite his doubts, Timmy decided to give Miss McMullen a chance, hoping she would be a worthy stand-in for Mrs. Thompson. Unbeknownst to him, the coming days would bring uncertainty and unexpected challenges, testing his resolve in ways he never anticipated. Timmy watched uneasily as the substitute teacher struggled with the lesson plan. There was something off about her, a subtle shift in her behavior that triggered alarm bells in his mind. Initially, he dismissed his concerns, thinking they stemmed from the usual discomfort of adjusting to a new teacher. Change was always hard for Timmy, and he didn't want his feelings to cloud his judgment. However, as her mistakes and confusion continued, his agitation grew. All he wanted was to learn, but in this chaotic environment it seemed impossible. As time passed, Timmy's unease turned into genuine concern as he noticed increasingly troubling behavior from Miss Jenkins. It was clear that something was seriously wrong. During lessons, Miss Jenkins often appeared dizzy, stumbling around the classroom as if struggling to keep her balance. Timmy watched in disbelief as she forgot what she was saying mid-sentence, or, worse, abruptly stopped speaking altogether, leaving the class in uncomfortable silence. These incidents became more frequent, casting confusion over the once orderly classroom. Timmy couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was definitely amiss. However, as suspicions grew, he grappled with a difficult question. Should he speak up and risk causing a scene, or remain silent, hoping things would eventually return to normal? At home, Timmy slumped onto the couch, still brooding over the day's events. His mom, noticing his subdued demeanor, asked about his day at school. He had spent the entire day with his head in his hands, frustrated and annoyed by the new teacher. "School was okay," Timmy replied with a forced smile. "We had a new teacher and she seemed nice." His mom, familiar with her son's challenges with change, gave him a knowing look. "Just okay? Are you sure everything was all right?" Timmy hesitated before responding. "Yeah, everything was fine. It was just different." His mom nodded understandingly. "Change can be difficult, Timmy, but it's a part of life. Sometimes we have to embrace it, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Remember when we talked about trying new things without sticking to a strict routine or schedule?" Timmy fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, struggling to find the right words. "It wasn't just the change, Mom. It was the way she taught. It's hard to explain. It felt like she didn't even know where she was half the time, and she talked like—" His mom's brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, her attention now fully on him, worry etched across her face. Timmy sighed, recognizing that explaining this to his mom might be challenging. She seemed clueless, like she was improvising the whole time. "I missed having a teacher who knew what they were doing," he said. His mom listened quietly, her face thoughtful. After a moment, she gently squeezed Timmy's hand. "I understand it's frustrating, but sometimes we need to give people a chance. Maybe she was just finding her way. Give it some time, okay?" Timmy nodded reluctantly, appreciating his mom's intent. But he couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach. As Timmy returned to school the next day, he couldn't shake the lingering unease that had settled in his mind. As he entered the classroom, he noticed a sense of chaos that seemed to permeate the air. The substitute teacher was late again, and the students took advantage of the opportunity to unleash their pent-up energy. This was the umpteenth time she'd been late since starting here, and he wondered why no one had noticed. Paper airplanes soared through the air, laughter echoed off the walls, and voices merged into a cacophony of noise. Timmy watched with a heavy heart as the once orderly classroom descended into chaos, longing for the return of Mrs. Thompson, the teacher he had come to admire and trust. Mrs. Thompson had always been more than just a teacher to Timmy. She had been a guiding light in a sea of uncertainty. Her patience and dedication had made learning a joyous experience, and Timmy found himself missing her more with each passing day. He remembered how she would go out of her way to ensure that every student understood the material, no matter how many times she had to explain it. Her passion for teaching had been infectious, inspiring Timmy to strive for excellence in everything he did. But as the days turned into weeks, there was still no sign of Mrs. Thompson. The substitute teacher continued to struggle, leaving Timmy and his classmates adrift in a sea of confusion. Despite his best efforts to remain optimistic, Timmy couldn't help but feel a sense of loss for the teacher he'd once known and admired. As he glanced around the chaotic classroom, he couldn't help but wonder when things would return to normal. But deep down, he knew that without Mrs. Thompson, things would never be the same again. And with each passing day, his longing for her guidance and wisdom only grew stronger. He longed for the days when Mrs. Thompson would stand at the front of the class, her warm smile and steady voice instilling a sense of calm and purpose in her students. But as the weeks stretched into what felt like an eternity, Timmy began to fear that those days were gone for good. With no sign of the no-good teacher, Timmy began to get antsy. He wasn't made to sit around and do nothing, and he didn't want to waste time doing nothing when he could get ahead on assignments. Just as Timmy was about to give up hope and leave the classroom, a sudden commotion at the door caught his attention. He turned to see the substitute teacher burst into the room, her face flushed and breathless. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," she exclaimed, her voice filled with urgency. "I had some trouble getting here, but I'm here now, and we can get started." Timmy's heart sank as he watched her struggle to catch her breath, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her belongings. Despite her best efforts to appear composed, it was clear that she was still struggling. As the class settled down and the substitute teacher began to fumble through her lesson plan, Timmy couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment wash over him. Despite his longing for order and stability, it seemed that chaos still reigned supreme in the classroom, and as he glanced around at his classmates, he knew that he wasn't alone in his frustration. Suddenly, the substitute teacher's strength seemed to give out entirely. With a gasp, she stumbled backward, her back colliding with the chalkboard with a loud thud. The class fell silent as they watched in shock, unsure of what to do. With great effort, Mrs. McMullen managed to regain her footing and stagger over to her desk. She sank into her chair, her breathing heavy and labored, as she leaned heavily against the desk for support. Timmy's heart sank as he watched her struggle, his earlier frustration giving way to concern and empathy. It was clear to him now that something was seriously wrong, and he couldn't help but wonder what he could do to help. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. McMullen's condition seemed to worsen. She slumped forward in her chair, her eyes drooping with exhaustion, until finally she succumbed to sleep, her head resting on the desk. Timmy felt a surge of frustration welling up inside him. He was unused to this level of disarray in the classroom, and he couldn't stand the thought of sitting idly by while the teacher slept. Determined to take matters into his own hands, Timmy rose from his seat and made his way to Mrs. McMullen's desk. Ignoring the stares of his classmates, he retrieved the worksheets from the drawer and began to distribute them to his fellow students. Despite the chaos unfolding around him, Timmy remained focused on the task at hand. He moved methodically from desk to desk, ensuring that each student received a worksheet before returning to his seat. As he settled back into his chair, Timmy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his actions. While the situation was far from ideal, he had refused to let it overwhelm him, instead choosing to take action and make the best of a bad situation. And as he glanced around the classroom, he could see the gratitude reflected in the eyes of his classmates, a silent acknowledgement of his determination to keep the learning process moving forward. As Timmy busily collected the worksheets to hand out to his classmates, he suddenly felt a cold sensation seep through his shoe. Frowning in confusion, he glanced down, only to be met with the sight of a small puddle of amber liquid spreading across the floor beneath him. His heart sank as realization dawned upon him. It wasn't just water that had soaked through his shoe. It was something far more troubling. The pungent smell confirmed his suspicions. It was urine. A wave of embarrassment washed over Timmy as he realized that the liquid must have come from Mrs. McMullen. The sight of her slumped over her desk, still sound asleep, made his stomach churn with unease. As Timmy approached Mrs. McMullen's desk, intent on waking her to inform her of the situation, he noticed something alarming. The desk drawer, from which he had retrieved the worksheets earlier, was leaking a dark, viscous liquid, staining the papers inside. His heart raced with a mixture of concern and confusion. What could be causing this strange occurrence? Was Mrs. McMullen storing something hazardous in her desk? Pushing aside his apprehension, Timmy reached out to gently shake Mrs. McMullen's shoulder, intending to rouse her from her slumber. But to his dismay, she remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow and erratic. Panic surged through Timmy as he realized the gravity of the situation. Mrs. McMullen wasn't just asleep, she was unconscious. Frantically, he shook her again, calling out her name in a desperate attempt to awaken her. But still, there was no response. Fear gripped Timmy as he realized that something was seriously wrong. Without hesitation, he knew that he had to seek help immediately. Racing to the classroom door, he flung it open and sprinted down the hallway, his mind reeling with worry for his teacher and the safety of his classmates. Timmy's footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as he raced towards the principal's office, his heart pounding with urgency. With each stride, his mind raced with worry for Mrs. McMullen and the gravity of the situation unfolding in the classroom. Finally reaching the principal's office, Timmy burst through the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Principal Adams!" he exclaimed, his voice urgent and frantic. "You need to come quickly. Something's wrong with Mrs. McMullen. She needs help." The principal, startled by Timmy's sudden appearance and distress, quickly rose from his desk, concern etched across his face. "What happened, Timmy? Slow down and tell me everything," he urged, his voice calm but firm. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Timmy recounted the events that had transpired in the classroom, from Mrs. McMullen's erratic behavior to her sudden collapse and unconsciousness. With each word, his fear and concern for his teacher grew more palpable. Principal Adams wasted no time in following Timmy back to the classroom, his concern growing with each passing moment. As they entered the room, he rushed to Mrs. McMullen's side, kneeling beside her desk to assess her condition. With a heavy heart, Principal Adams gently shook Mrs. McMullen, calling her name in a calm yet urgent tone. But to his dismay, she remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow and faint. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Principal Adams knew that immediate action was necessary. With a sense of determination, he reached for the phone on Mrs. McMullen's desk, dialing the emergency services. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the air as an ambulance arrived at the school. Paramedics rushed into the classroom, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. The children were quickly ushered to the back of the class, away from the commotion. With practiced efficiency, the paramedics carefully lifted Mrs. McMullen onto a stretcher, securing her in place before gently carrying her out of the classroom. Timmy watched with a heavy heart as his teacher disappeared from view, surrounded by a flurry of activity. As the ambulance pulled away from the school, Timmy couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over him. He knew that Mrs. McMullen was in good hands, but the uncertainty of her condition weighed heavily on his mind. All he could do now was wait anxiously for news, hoping and praying for her swift recovery. As the ambulance departed with Mrs. McMullen, Principal Adams remained behind in the classroom, his primary concern now shifting to the well-being of the students. With a calming presence, he approached the children, his voice steady and reassuring. "Everyone, please take your seats," he said gently, gesturing towards the desks. "Another teacher will be with you shortly. I want to assure you that Mrs. McMullen is in good hands, and she will be okay." As the students settled into their seats, Principal Adams took a moment to stand at Mrs. McMullen's desk, his thoughts consumed by worry for his colleague and friend. It was then that he noticed the puddle beneath her desk, a dark stain on the otherwise pristine floor. Realizing that the spill needed to be cleaned up, Principal Adams retrieved a mop from the janitorial closet and began to mop up the liquid. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. His curiosity piqued, Principal Adams paused in his task and turned his attention to the desk drawer from which the liquid seemed to be emanating. With a sense of trepidation, he slowly opened the drawer, unsure of what he might find. What he saw inside left him speechless. As Principal Adams stared in disbelief, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and he realized that there was much more to Mrs. McMullen's condition than met the eye. The principal of the school gazed down at the drawer he had just opened, his eyes wide and his mouth hanging open. Timmy's stomach fell, wondering if he got his teacher in trouble. The principal did not look very happy. The principal's face twisted with anger, and he slammed the desk shut, more liquid spilling onto the freshly mopped and paper towel floor. Timmy jumped, his eyes wide as he stared at the angry principal. The children were startled, all of them looking at the principal, but he only shook his head and told them to hang tight while he got a substitute. He stormed out of the class and slammed the door, and Timmy wondered what he had just done. As the children awaited the arrival of their new substitute teacher, the atmosphere in the classroom was palpably different. Mrs. McMullen's absence left a void that seemed to weigh heavily on everyone's spirits. Timmy, in particular, felt a sense of unease gnawing at him as he watched the door, anticipating the unfamiliar face that would soon enter. When the substitute finally stepped into the room, her warm smile and friendly demeanor did little to dispel the lingering tension. As she began to distribute the worksheets for the day, Timmy mechanically accepted his assignment. But his mind was elsewhere. The guilt he felt for his role in Mrs. McMullen's current situation weighed heavily on him, casting a shadow over his ability to concentrate. Despite his best efforts to focus on the task at hand, Timmy found himself lost in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow betrayed his teacher by seeking help, even if it was out of genuine concern. The uncertainty of Mrs. McMullen's condition only added to his anxiety, leaving him feeling adrift and unsure of how to reconcile his actions with his conscience. As the substitute teacher continued with the lesson, Timmy's mind remained preoccupied with thoughts of Mrs. McMullen. He couldn't help but wonder if she was okay, if she would recover from whatever had caused her to collapse. The guilt he felt for potentially causing her more trouble by involving the principal gnawed at him, leaving him feeling like he had somehow failed his teacher. With each passing moment, Timmy's unease only grew stronger. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe he should have kept quiet, that he had overreacted by seeking help. What if Mrs. McMullen had just needed rest? What if he had made things worse for her by bringing attention to her condition? Despite his mother's reservations, Timmy couldn't shake the nagging feeling of responsibility that gnawed at him. He felt a deep-seated need to make amends for what had happened, to offer Mrs. McMullen some semblance of comfort in her time of need. However, as he weighed the pros and cons of visiting her, he couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that lingered in the back of his mind. As the days passed, Timmy found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he longed to reach out to Mrs. McMullen and offer her his support. On the other hand, he feared the potential consequences of his actions and the impact they might have on her already precarious situation. Despite his best efforts to push the thoughts from his mind, they continued to plague him, refusing to be ignored. As Timmy contemplated his next course of action, he couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to make things right. Though the road ahead seemed fraught with uncertainty, he remained determined to find a way to offer Mrs. McMullen the help and support she so desperately needed. As the news of Mrs. McMullen's potential arrest spread like wildfire, Timmy felt a sense of panic begin to rise within him. He couldn't believe that things had escalated to this point, and he couldn't help but feel like he was somehow to blame. Had his actions led to this dire outcome? Could he have done something differently to prevent this from happening? Despite his mother's attempts to calm his fears, Timmy couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him like a dark cloud. The uncertainty of what the future held for Mrs. McMullen left him feeling helpless and overwhelmed. He knew that he had to find a way to help her, but he didn't know where to begin. As he grappled with his emotions, Timmy realized that he couldn't let fear and guilt paralyze him. He had to find a way to take action, to somehow make amends for what had happened. With a heavy heart and a determined spirit, he resolved to do whatever it took to help Mrs. McMullen, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead.